My topic for today is Kristeva, the Stoics, and the true life of interpretations. I've taken the phrase true life of interpretations from Kristeva's article, Psychoanalysis in the Polis, where its meaning will become clear in the course of this paper. My reason for doing so is that it simultaneously points towards the heart of Kristeva's critical disagreement with Stoicism and indicates the relevance of that disagreement with Stoicism for this conference on ethics and self-cultivation. In Hellenistic Ethics, the end toward which all aspiration and effort are oriented is a certain sort of life. Exercises of self-cultivation aim to realize or sustain this sort of life, usually via the intermediaries of virtue and wisdom. This is true for Kristeva as well. As both a psychoanalyst and a cultural critic, she has a consistent vision of an ideal sort of life, or at least the moral psychological core of any such life, and of the exercises of self-cultivation by which that life must be constituted and nourished. Furthermore, by making interpretation one of her master terms for this life, she encourages us to consider how our philosophical activities, including the activity we are engaged in at this very instant, are already a sort of self-cultivation, whether constitutive of virtue and happiness or vice and misery. Remains to be considered, or discovered. My agenda in this paper is twofold. First, I'd like to explain what Kristeva says about Stoicism, which is one of her regular, recurrent points of reference. It thus receives mention in many of her works, but for reasons of space, my analysis will revolve around her article, Psychoanalysis in the Polis. Her claims there are difficult to understand, both because they require familiarity with the seminal and audacious scholarship of Émile Playe and Victor Goldschmidt, and because she deliberately eschews dispassionate rigor and clarity in favor of affective involvement with the topic and the situation in which she writes. In other words, she performs her ethics of interpretation. Working through these challenges in order to understand her suggestions will shed new light on a rich tradition that begins with Henri Bergson, to whose chair at the Sorbonne Playe succeeded, and encompasses the amazingly erudite and ambitious work of Playe's student Goldschmidt, Deleuze's logic of sense, and ongoing work today. I just want to mention, I'm going to be talking about Goldschmidt quite a bit. I just want to mention that Goldschmidt's work, I think, is perhaps undercited and underappreciated. In some sense, Ado, well, at least Ado is an alternative too. I don't want to say that they're, obviously that they absolutely diverge. But, well, initially they did diverge. Initially they disagreed quite a lot. And Goldschmidt might have quite a lot to contribute to this, to the consideration of Hellenistic ethics as arts of self-cultivation as well. My second objective is to sketch a critical response to Kristeva's presentation of Stoicism. The point is not to praise or condemn her accuracy, but rather to develop and test a new perspective on the existential option that is the Stoic life of interpretations. In other words, I think that Kristeva, like Deleuze, Foucauld, and many other European philosophers, can help us to appreciate aspects of Stoicism that the Greek and Roman Stoics did not articulate. In Psychoanalysis in the Polis, Kristeva writes, quote, "I would say that interpretation as an epistemological and ethical attitude began with the Stoics. Man, says Epictetus, is born to contemplate God and his works, and not only to contemplate them, but also to interpret them. To interpret in this context, and I think always, means to make a connection. Thus, the birth of interpretation is considered the birth of semiology, since the semiological sciences relate a sign, an event sign, to a signified in order to act accordingly, consistently, consequently." End quotation. This quotation makes clear the importance Kristeva attributes to Stoicism as the originary and preeminent example of a certain interpretive model. I will not address her assertion about the Stoics' chronological priority. What interests me instead is her claim that the Stoics' epistemological and ethical attitude, which is revealed in their interpretive activity, can be encapsulated by the term semiology, i.e., making a connection among three elements: a sign, a signified, and an action. What does that mean? Before attempting to clarify this, it's best to complete the list of elements connected according to Kristeva in Stoic semiology. In her article, From One Identity to Another, she argues that, quote, "Every language theory is predicated upon a conception of the subject that it explicitly posits, implies, or tries to deny," end quote. There she mentions Stoic language theory only in passing, saying that she will not, quote, refer back to the Stoic sage, who guaranteed both the signs triad and the inductive conditional clause. All of these quotations are on your handout, incidentally. In this compressed reference, the phrase inductive conditional clause refers to the connections we have just seen among sign, signify, and action. I will explain this more thoroughly in a moment. We might think of this as the secondary level of Stoic semiology. But the term signs triad introduces something new, namely the connections of signifying word to signifying concept, and both of them to the external referent. We might call this the primary level of Stoic semiology. Kristeva is saying that Stoic semiology is an epistemological and ethical attitude of the accomplished philosopher, who, as she says here, guarantees both the primary and the secondary connections. In order to understand this, we need to detour via Kristeva's and the Stoics' beliefs about language. For Kristeva, language ought to be the last in a series of mechanisms for mediating and managing the intensity of our needs, joys, and frustrations vis-a-vis other people. She expresses this by saying that the engine of language is primal want, or the archaic sexual thing with a capital T. To put it another way, the thing represents our unnameable and overwhelming fascination, love, frustration, and hatred toward other people, which is fundamental to the human experience. Our first infantile way of relating to the thing is via kinetic and sensorial rhythms and patterns, which Kristeva calls the semiotic. These are experienced as an immediate relation to the maternal body as possessor of the thing. But in the normative sequence of development, the child abjects this relation to the maternal body and invests its loves and hatreds in paternal signifiers instead, the big other in place of the mother. Kristeva calls this the thetic break. Like Lacan, she designates the ensuing domain of signification the symbolic. But unlike Lacan, Kristeva places great emphasis on the enduring importance of both semiotic patterns and imaginary polysemy within language, both of which she sees as supplements and potential rivals to signification as means of expressing our relation to the thing. Let us look more closely now at Kristeva's theory of thetic signification. All thetic acts simultaneously posit something about external reference and represent the subject of enunciation in her immediate interaction with the thing. For example, if I say, the Stoics are brilliant, on the one hand I am picking out a reference, which I designate with the signifier Stoics, and connecting it with an evaluative concept represented by the signifier brilliant. But on the other hand, I am also positioning myself, the subject of enunciation, vis-a-vis the symbolic other, of whom you are the present representatives, and I am struggling to say what I can never articulate, but which we might gloss as, you frustrate me, I hate you, I love you, please satisfy me, and so on. To put it another way, beneath every illocutionary function, such as explaining, persuading, and so on, the foundational and unachievable illocutionary aim is to occupy a satisfying position vis-a-vis the thing. Let us now return to Kristeva's claim that the Stoic sage guarantees the connections among signifier, signified, and referent. In text 3, Kristeva writes, quote, there is no sign that is not thetic, and every sign is already the germ of a sentence. Stoic semiology, which was the first to formulate the matrix of the sign, had already established this complicity between sign and sentence, making them proofs of one another. Why does Kristeva say that every sign is already the germ of a sentence? Because even if a child says, woof woof, I'm taking this example actually directly from Kristeva, she is really saying, this is a woof woof. It is in predication that the subject of enunciation appears. The child is enunciating this proposition for her caretaker, in the hope of eliciting a response. Yes, the father might say adoringly, that is a woof woof, or no, that's a meow, or whatever. Thus, it is the primal want behind predicating enunciation that creates the complicity between the sign and the sentence. But this does not explain why Kristeva claims that the Stoics themselves, quote, had already established this complicity between sign and sentence. In order to reconstruct her sequence of thought, we must first recall that, loosely speaking, the triad of signifier, signified, and referent goes back to the Stoic. For the Stoics, written or spoken words do not designate bodies, which are the only beings recognized in their ontology. Rather, a written or spoken signifier designates an incorporeal signified, which expresses an impression made upon the speaker's soul by the bodily bearer of this signification. The incorporeal signified may be thought of as an event or an effect, which the speaker understands and asserts as true or false. Sorry, as true or false sayable. No, this is not a sentence. Okay, as true or false sayables. Let me read the sentence again. The incorporeal signified may be thought of as an event or an effect, which the speaker understands and asserts as a true or false sayable regarding the underlying bodily cause. Because they are incorporeal, these sayable events do not exist. They are not beings. Rather, they are somethings which subsist. Second, we must follow up Kristeva's vague reference to Émile Breillet's pioneering study, La théorie des incorporels dans l'ancien stoïcisme. According to Breillet, Stoic metaphysics of language, quote, radically separates two planes of being. On the one hand, deep and real being, force. On the other, the plane of facts, which play on the surface of being, and which constitute a multiplicity without connection or end. I think many of you will recognize that quotation from near the beginning of Logic of Sense. Later, Breillet speaks of reason's spontaneity as the active cause which constructs rational significations. It is Breillet's reading of the evidence that allows Kristeva to assimilate the primary level of Stoic semiology to her own theory of language, namely the position that the world of facts about external reference is fabricated by the signifying subject in the moment of predicating enunciation. We are now in a position to return to the secondary level of Stoic semiology, and the Stoic sage's guarantee of the inductive conditional clause, i.e. the connections among sign, signified, and action. Here again we must follow up a vague citation in Kristeva's endnotes, this time to Victor Goldschmidt's Le Système Stoicien et l'idée du temps. One of the key passages for Goldschmidt is section 8 of Epictetus' manual. Quote, don't search for events to happen as you want, but want events to happen as they do. End quote. At the point where he introduces this quotation, Goldschmidt also quotes the passage of Epictetus included by Kristeva in text 1. It's worth quoting Goldschmidt at some length here, since his exact wording informs Kristeva's meaning. This is text 4 in your handout. Quote, in order to want events as they happen, we must know and understand them. We must interpret them. Interpret means make a connection, end quote. Recall now what Kristeva wrote in text 1. Man, says Epictetus, is born to contemplate God and his works. And not only to contemplate them, but also to interpret them. To interpret in this context, I think, always means to make a connection. It is clear that Kristeva had Goldschmidt's book open to this page as she was writing. Understanding what Goldschmidt means by making a connection, and what it has to do with wanting events as they happen, will turn out to be essential for appreciating what Kristeva is trying to say. For Goldschmidt, the phrase, want what happens, encapsulates the fundamental aspiration of the Stoic life, which is to align your volition with the reason of God, whose providential law is also the universal causal nexus of destiny, as we've just been discussing with John. In other words, God's benevolent and rational plan determines absolutely every sayable event in the Stoic universe. Goldsmith distinguishes two planes of interpretation in Stoic philosophy, which are two pathways towards cognitive and effective alignment with God. In the first, this is text 5, quote, the two terms, when we're dealing with events, are separated in time. One, the event sign, which we must interpret, is given to us in the present, end quote. Note here the term event sign, which Kristeva has picked up in text 1. The semiological sciences, she said, quote, relate a sign, an event sign, to a signified in order to act accordingly. End quote. In this pathway, the interpreter attempts to align her volition with God's by inferring, through her grasp of theology and physics, for example, which event will follow from the present event sign. She then desires that divinely ordained event. But Goldschmidt believes that the emphasis in Stoicism falls instead on the second pathway. This is what Epictetus calls the use of impressions, i.e. the cautious scrutiny of our thoughts about whatever is presently happening. In this pathway, we don't connect a present event sign to a future one, since this is often beyond our capacity. We don't understand what the plan of God is. Instead, acknowledging our cognitive limitations, we connect a present event sign to an appropriate reaction on our part. As Goldsmith says, quote, "The use of impressions brings us already to action. Understanding an impression consists in knowing which virtue we should use in connection with the object that has produced it." Again, let me illustrate this. As an example of an event sign, I will adapt an example from the Roman Stoic Musonius Rufus. I am at dinner and the host serves me bread and butter. Now, for this example, let us also imagine that I already have in my mind some Stoic beliefs, like that intemperate behavior is vicious and vice is to be avoided. What in this case is the inductive conditional clause to which Kristeva refers, which connects an event sign to a signified and consequently an action. It is something like this. If I use too much butter, or eat more than my share of bread, or get food on my clothes, this is intemperate. This is closely adapted from Musonius. If this is intemperate, it is to be avoided, end quote. Now, according to Stoic psychology, if I assent to the proposition, it is to be avoided, action follows immediately. Thus, in this example, I have connected an event sign, namely, I am eating bread and butter, to a complex signified, namely, using too much butter, eating more than my share, and eating messily are to be avoided. Furthermore, I have connected this signified to action. By assenting to this signified, I immediately put myself on guard against indecorous eating. Now that we understand how Kristeva reads the Stoic model of interpretation, we are ready to appreciate her critical response. This comes across most clearly in text 6. Quote, "The person through whom knowledge comes about is not mad, but, as the Stoics have indicated, he is subject to death. The time of accurate interpretation, that is, an interpretation in accordance with destiny, or the other's phallus, is a moment that includes and completes eternity. Interpretation is consequently both happiness and death, death of time and of the subject, suicide. The transformation of sexual desire into the desire to know an object deprives the subject of this desire and abandons him or reveals him as subject to death. Interpretation in its felicitous accuracy, expurgating passion and desire, reveals the interpreter as master of his will, but at the same time as slave of death. Stoicism is the last great pagan ideology, tributary of nature as mother, raised to the phallic rank of destiny to be interpreted." End quote. I will not attempt to address every facet of that dense poetic passage. Rather, I will focus on 3 claims it advances about the Stoic model of interpretation. First, Stoic interpretation includes and completes eternity. Second, it is a sort of suicide or death. These first 2 claims take their inspiration from Goldschmidt, but substantially transform the significance of his reading. Third, Stoic interpretation is an ideology. This claim moves beyond the epistemology and ethics of Stoicism in order to encompass its political implications. It's best to deal with the first 2 claims together. The first, that Stoic interpretation includes and completes eternity, rests on Goldschmidt's analysis of the interplay of the 2 pathways of Stoic interpretation. As we have just seen, for Goldschmidt it is because I know my limits that I do not always attempt to understand the providential nexus of destiny, but rather more often focus on aligning my volition with God's within my immediate circumstances. Thus I put all my energy into buttering that bread as beautifully and virtuously as I can, for example. Yet in wanting what happens in this limited way, I nevertheless integrate myself into the entire series of divinely willed events. The divine law that I obey in consuming dinner virtuously is the same law that governs nature. In fact, I am not other than God, for God pervades the entire universe as its active principle, and is particularly concentrated in rational souls like mine. This is the key to understanding Stoic compatibilism. Insofar as I manage to think and act in accord with nature, divinely determined events become my freely chosen actions. Thus, in a sense, the eternity of providence is telescoped into my action. The second claim, that Stoic interpretation is somehow suicidal, emerges from the same trend in Goldschmidt's thinking. According to the Stoics in text 7, quote, living in accordance with nature comes to be the end. Engaging in no activity typically forbidden by the universal law, which is the right reason pervading everything and identical to Zeus, who is the director of the administration of existing things." End quote. Furthermore, they insist that this end, which can also be called happiness, can be completed in an instant. Goldschmidt explains that on the one hand, this is the instant in which the Stoic sage connects the event sign with an action that is natural, reasonable, and therefore in alignment with the universal law of Zeus. The concordance of sage and God in this instant is perfect. It cannot be improved by temporal extension. On the other hand, because the moral agent's initiative is integrated into God's enduring providence, this instant expands throughout time. Thus, the moment of virtue satisfies our desire for eternity and leaves nothing lacking from our happiness. As Goldschmidt perorates, quote, "The instant is able to contain and encompass the centuries of cosmic cycles. Thus, the instant extends throughout the eternal presence of Zeus, like a drop of wine extends to the dimensions of the ocean and penetrates its entirety." Goldschmidt's tone is rhapsodic, but Kristeva's appropriation of his reading transforms it into a pointed critique. For Kristeva, the eternity completed by the Stoic would be what she calls time as project, teleology, linear and perspective unfolding, time as history. The teleological project here is that of God, whose purpose has determined once and for all what is good and choice-worthy or bad and avoidance-worthy. In effect, God's relation hypostasizes the symbolic values established for the speaking subject by the thetic break. In other words, divine law and reason are names given to the big other signifiers, in which the speaking subject has invested her drive energy at the moment of surrendering the narcissistic jouissance of the mother-child union. Kristeva believes this thetic break is experienced as a sacrifice or loss, which reiterates and exacerbates the primal want underlying all interpersonal relations. When symbolic value is fixed once and for all, as in Stoicism, this loss becomes irremediable. This is why Kristeva calls the totalizing instant of Stoic interpretation a kind of suicide or death. Quote, "Time in Western philosophy always refers to the time of death," she writes. The results for the subject of this totalization vary, but might include absence of affect, evacuation of meaningfulness from the world, or compensatory violent acting out. The alternative for Kristeva is to avoid temporal finalization and evaluative totalization. She believes this is possible because, as I emphasized earlier, symbolic signification continues to be underpinned by semiotic articulations and imaginary polysemy, both of which go back to our non-linguistic relations to our primary caregivers. These asignifying modes of relating, emoting, and enjoying combine with thetic signification in vital and creative speech, which Kristeva calls signifiance. Examples in Kristeva's work include the speech of poets and literary authors in general, which Kristeva calls a kind of second birth, the discourse of literary appreciation, through which we participate in the shareable singularity of creative genius, the speech of psychoanalysts who avoid, quote, "playing dead and adopting a Stoic apathy in order to make each analysis a, quote, work of art, combining thetic reason with counter-transferential jouissance, the masochistic sublimation of Christian mystics, and, most controversially, the speech of maternal passion." All of these modes of interpretation, i.e. of making a connection, encourage the creativity and vitality supposedly choked off by Stoic totalization. In other words, they make it possible to initiate genuinely new beginnings, breaking the linear teleology of historical time. And they facilitate the sublimation of drive and language, imbuing it with affect and meaningfulness. Kristeva's third claim is simply the politicized consequence of the first two, as her commentary on Zeno's Republic in her book Strangers to Ourselves exemplifies. Given the totalization of symbolic value and exclusion of semiotic and imaginary interventions, Kristeva suggests that Stoic politics can only oscillate between two undesirable tendencies. On the one hand, the anomia of each individual's obedience to divine volition, which replaces positive law. This is how Kristeva interprets the testimony that Zeno in his ideal city permitted cannibalism and incest and sacrilege and so on. On the other, institutionalizing values attributed to divine volition could lead to totalitarianism. To both of these, Kristeva prefers a middle way, in which citizens preserve the creativity and vitality of desire and jouissance, which singularize them, but use their shared investment in symbolic signification to collaborate in constructing narratives and making decisions. The living political bond, she writes in text 8, understood and practiced as a sharing of creativity, calls upon the singularity of each person. I've now completed parts 1 and 2 of this paper, you'll be happy to hear, namely a clarification of Kristeva's reading of Stoicism and explanation of her critical response. To recapitulate briefly, she claims that the Stoic sage makes herself the guarantor of both the first level of semiological connections, namely those in the triad of signifier, signified, and referent, and of the second level, namely from the sign generated by the initial triad to another sign which leads directly to action. In so doing, the sage absolutizes pathetic values and exacerbates the feeling of loss generated by the pathetic break. The result is mortification of the psyche, truncation of creativity, and poisoning of political agency. Obviously, this is not the model of self-cultivation Kristeva advocates. Rather, she emphasizes the need to remain open to non-signifying semiotic and imaginary resources. In the remaining few minutes, I'd like to initiate a discussion about the merits of Kristeva's understanding and criticism of Stoicism. In other words, I want to consider its importance for those of us interested in Stoicism, not only as an intriguing historical phenomenon, but as a source of inspiration for self-cultivation and philosophical living today. This is a big question, obviously, and I want to emphasize that my answers are merely starting points. With this in mind, I will first suggest that Kristeva's analysis sheds considerable light on some aspects of some Stoic texts. Let me begin with a general point of doctrine. One could plausibly argue that Stoic moral psychology revolves around a fundamental and non-rational drive, which is called oikeiosis. No single word in English effectively translates this word, though appropriation serves best. What it connotes is each organism's impulse to preserve and protect what belongs to it. In Greek, it's systasis. In Latin, it's constitutio. In English, it's constitution. Seneca defines a constitution as, quote, the hegemonic part of the soul disposed in a certain way toward the body. This definition implies ontological technicalities that I can't go into here. But suffice to say that the disposition of the hegemonic part of the soul towards the body is a sustaining principle of an animal's vital unity. Every animal is, quote, pleased with, loves, yearns for, and thinks well of this vital unity. Those are all quotations from Stoic texts, which just is itself. The character of this vital unity develops over time, so that a human infant, for example, appropriates a different constitution than she will as an adolescent, an adult, and so on. Up to a certain stage, this happens without cognitive mediation, just as other animals are supposedly impelled to preserve their own constitutions. But at a certain stage, something changes in human beings. As Diogenes writes in text 9, quote, since reason has been bestowed on rational beings, to live correctly in accordance with reason comes to be natural for them. For reason supervenes as the craftsman of impulse, end quote. Two discrete positions are compressed in this testimony. First, whereas animals are automatically impelled toward what will preserve their constitution, in humans, reason, or logos, should come to supervise impulses. Second, precisely this use of reason, since it is natural for mature human beings, becomes the central feature in their constitution. The right and legitimate use of reason is to align our volition with that of Zeus, who, as we saw in text 7, is identical with right reason. Thus, appropriation is designed to culminate with the coincidence of autonomy and theonomy in human happiness. I would like to cautiously suggest a limited, and I think very daring, probably foolhardy comparison between this developmental psychology and that of Kristeva. Granted, there is a striking difference between Kristeva's fundamental drive toward the archaic thing and the Stoics' fundamental drive towards self-preservation and self-perfection. Nevertheless, there is a thought-provoking resemblance between key moments in the two developmental theories, namely the Stoic appropriation of reason and what Kristeva calls the pathetic break. The pathetic break marks the epical shift of libidinal investment from parental bodies and associated sensations to symbolic signifiers. In a similar way, one could argue that in the Stoic account, appropriation of reason shifts the fundamental impetus from things to reasoning about things. Again, let me exemplify. A child is immediately concerned with her own mental and bodily integrity on the Stoic account. And adults may be immediately concerned with the well-being of their children, friends, or spouses. But in order for reason to fulfill its role as the craftsman of impulse, we should not desire the well-being of our own bodies or those of our children, friends, or spouses for their own sakes. Rather, we should wish to act in conformity with right reason, and perceive that it is legitimate and reasonable in most circumstances to cherish our bodies, to cherish our children, our friends, and our spouses. Thus, reason would intervene as the primary object of appropriative feelings, in a sense estranging us from prior intimacies. If there is anything to this suggestion, it could be taken to embed deep in Stoic theory some of the problems criticized by Kristeva. But even if this comparison at the level of theory turns out to be indefensible, at the level of practice, I think it's hard to deny that Stoics sometimes adopt the role of ideology police, or what Kristeva in text 10 calls, quote, wardens of repression and rationalizers of the social contract. She says that apropos of Stoicism. There are innumerable examples of this, but for reasons of time, I'll just give you one. In text 11a, Heracles writes that, quote, we should guard the laws of our fatherland as if they were second gods of a kind, and live by their guidance. In fact, second god is a favorite synonym for Heracles, who also says we should treat our fatherland itself and our parents like second gods. This is more than a simile, of course. It points toward divine law and reason as the preeminent elements in our own constitution. But for Kristeva, Stoic God, as we've heard, is merely a hypothesis of repressive symbolic values. Thus it should come as no surprise that when Heracles writes, quote, I for my part welcome Zaleucus, the legendary lawgiver of the Locrians, who made it law that anyone who proposed a new law should do it with a noose around his throat, so that he should be instantly strangled and die, unless he rearranged the original constitution of the state in a way that was most emphatically profitable to the community, end quote. And it's not only the laws that must be treated as second gods. Heracles adds that, quote, no less than the laws, customs must also be guarded, those that are truly ancestral, or we could say paternal, translating the word in Greek. Custom aims to be a kind of unwritten law, which is enrolled as its noble lawgiver, the satisfaction of all those who make use of it, end quote. From a Kristevan perspective, one might make two observations about this passage. First, Heracles is indeed operating as a warden of repression and rationalizer of the social contract. In effect, he makes the symbolic values enshrined in civic law and social custom unbreakable parameters for choice and action. Under the regime of Zaleucus, there is precious little room for creative renewal through a life-giving return to pre-rational jouissance and imagination. Who would risk creative innovation in a democracy if the cost of any mistake were that he should be instantly strangled and die? Second, one might detect in this fantasy of violent reprisal, which is authorized by the legendary paternal lawgiver, the return of what has been repressed by Stoic rationalism. In other words, the energies excluded by the rigidification of symbolic value return as violent acting out, even if only at the level of rhetoric. These considerations lead me to suspect that Kristeva has identified a dangerous temptation within Stoicism, something excluded from the Greek and Romans' own self-understanding. However, in other ways, I think that Kristeva's reading is very one-sided. These all come back to a fundamental error, namely her consistent reading of Stoic doctrines about virtue as straightforward descriptions of the lived experience of Stoicism. In fact, the ideal of virtue, which is embodied in the sage, operates rather as an organizing fantasy. Commentators in general pay too little attention to a fundamental contradiction within Stoicism. On the one hand, by explicit doctrine, virtue can be achieved. You can live the happiness of God. On the other, by unbreakable convention, no practitioner can claim that she or any other Stoic has achieved virtue. For this reason, I think we should view Stoic virtue roughly as Jonathan Lear suggests we view Aristotelian contemplation. Quote, any form of life, Lear writes, will tend to generate a fantasy of what it is to get outside of that life. This is because life is experienced, consciously and unconsciously, as being lived under pressure. and it is correlative to that experience that there is a fantasy of release, end quote. Like Aristotle's fantasy of self-sufficient contemplation, the Stoic fantasy needs to be theoretically achievable in order to make life meaningful. In Kristeva's terms, this allows it to harness drive energy to symbolic significations. Yet it also needs to be practically inachievable, or else it would implode and give way to a new fantasy. This insight has both general and specific consequences. The general consequence is that we should acknowledge how much creative improvisation is involved in the Stoic effort to live in harmony with divine volition. Although Stoics sometimes come across as vindictive agents of symbolic law, they also place a great deal of emphasis on circumstantial complexity. An infinite distance separates fidelity to general ethical guidelines from perception of the virtuous thing to do in any particular situation. This is why Stoics insist that all errors are equal. You're either with God or you're against him. Killing your father and misbuttering your bread are equally vicious. This leaves a lot of room for creative initiative in the performance of virtue. Such creativity is emblematized by the unorthodox Stoic Aristo, who entirely rejects ethical guidelines, focusing exclusively on the sage's adventitious capacity to respond to opportunity and circumstance. But even within orthodox Stoicism, which aims to strike a balance between extemporaneity and principled foresight, the upshot is that every Stoic decision can in principle make room for creative intervention. More specific consequences reveal themselves in those passages of Stoic texts in which the yearning to understand and to imitate God becomes explicitly thematized. It is here more than anywhere that we might glimpse something like a relation to the archaic thing, at the boundaries where a penumbra of drive energy suffuses aesthetic reasoning. I will offer just two examples to close. Perhaps I'm not going to digress and psychoanalyze my opinions. Okay. The first comes from Musonius Rufus, who is perhaps the Stoic author most given to ideological policing. As I discuss in a forthcoming article, Musonius' handling of sex, eating, and grooming is astoundingly sanctimonious and repressive. Yet Musonius is also unusually given to fantasies about divine volition. Again, I have written elsewhere about the masochistic jubilation in his discourse, Whether We Should Always Obey Our Parents, which hinges on a complex interplay between an actual Roman father who prohibits his son from philosophizing and the cosmic father who positively commands it. I won't reduplicate that analysis here. Instead, I want to focus on his discourse concerning nourishment. In this discourse, Musonius encourages his listeners to restrict their diet to uncooked vegetables and dairy products. But above all, he exhorts them to avoid meat. Quote, nourishment from the plants of the earth is naturally suited to us. So is nourishment from animals that are not harmed, especially domestic animals, like ripe fruits and vegetables, milk, cheese, and honeycombs. By contrast, he used to say, this is still part of the quotation, that nourishment by meat was heavier and somehow impeded thought and cognition, because the rising vapors from it were muddier and darkened the soul. So people who eat a lot of meat appear to be slower of mind, end quotation. Here we can see the beginnings of a rational justification for avoiding meat, which is grounded in physiology. When meat is digested, it produces rising vapors that impede cognition. From this perspective, Musonius is sketching an enthymeme grounded in symbolic values. This allows him to understand the world, and through that understanding to achieve satisfaction. Yet we should also notice the prevalence of images of heaviness, slowness, muddiness, and darkness. Added to the reminiscences of ripe fruit, vegetables, milk, cheese, and honeycombs, this does sound like the promised land, this creates a rich sensual landscape. From this perspective, Musonius is discharging drive energy through a phantasmagoria of images that underpins or bypasses rational argumentation. This interplay of reasoning and fantasy climaxes in an exhortation to imitate the celestial gods. Quote, since human beings are the most akin of earthly organisms to the gods, Musonius says, we should also be nourished in a manner most similar to them. Now the exhalations of earth and water carried up to them are enough for the gods, so that if we took the lightest and purest nourishment, we would take the most similar nourishment to the gods. Let's pause and give this strangely literal comparison of human and astral nourishment due consideration. Like the preceding, it is structured by an enthymeme, grounded in theoretical commitments, although they're not explained here. The Stoics certainly believe that humans are the earthly organisms most akin to the gods. Moreover, they believe that the foundation of this kinship is our shared rationality. Even the physiology of our rational souls is similar. Both are constituted by breath, which is a compound of compacting moisture and expansive fire. This helps to explain the role of rising vapors and exhalations in Musonius' comparison. Within this breath, the compacting moisture is responsible for inward tension, which stabilizes organic forms. The expansive fire is the intelligent, directive element. Thus, Zeno calls the sun, quote, a fiery kindling from the vaporous rising of the sea. And Zeus himself is defined as, quote, intelligent, designing fire, which methodically proceeds towards the creation of the world. This helps to explain why Musonius counsels avoidance of dark and heavy meat. It is on the basis of these elemental homologies between human and celestial souls that Musonius infers we should prefer light, pure nourishment. On the other hand, we should also acknowledge how semiotic investment may underpin this line of reasoning. In making vital heat and breath the signifiers of human kinship with the gods, Stoic theory already makes respiratory and circulatory rhythms a domain in which semiotic and symbolic investments can easily converge. In focusing particularly on nourishment, Musonius accentuates this convergence. Henceforth, when I eat my rustic cheese and honey, I can think and feel that I am ingesting the rationality of the gods. To put it in psychoanalytic terms, this is an oral interjection. Beyond my rational alignment with God, I will be replaying a primal bodily relation to and identification with God or the gods. Perhaps some of the strangeness in Musonius' arguments comes from the way in which this drive facilitation and imaginary fantasy combine with the argumentative structure which he barely troubled to flesh out. I turn now to my final example, which is brief. It comes from Cornelius' Survey of Greek Theology, a text which has not yet even been adequately edited, much less translated into English. Cornelius addresses this text to an unnamed boy with whom he is discussing the allegorical meanings of Greek religious traditions. This text belongs to a domain of Stoic literature that scholars have found enigmatic. Why, they wonder, are Stoics so interested in the myths, iconography, and even rituals of the Olympian pantheon, which rational theology could conceivably render superfluous? Kristeva's work points towards a new way of resolving this enigma. For Kristeva, allegory is a paradigmatic example of how the imaginary operates, like a tense link between thing and meaning, the unnameable and the proliferation of signs, the silent affect and the ideality that designates and goes beyond it. End quote. In other words, imaginative constructions are halfway between symbolic signification and delirious proximity to the archaic thing. For example, the allegorical imagination both disowns the surface meaning, thus clinging to the archaic thing, and makes associative leaps to symbolism via acoustic and visual images, thus generating new quasi-meanings, meanings in which we only halfway believe. Take Cornelius' discussion of the god Hermes. This discussion extends over 6 pages of the Greek text, encompassing etymology of his name and epithets, exegesis of his literary and statuary images, and observations about some aspects of his cult. What binds this discussion together is Cornelius' initial assertion that Hermes represents logos, reason. Quote, Hermes happens to be logos, which the gods sent to us from heaven, making humans alone of earthly animals rational, which is the best thing the gods themselves possess. This assertion is justified by the etymological derivation of the name Hermes, from the phrase ere mesastai, meaning contrived to speak. This inaugural assertion grounds the entire fantasy that follows, which we might call an imaginary celebration of rationality. I'll give you just 3 moments in this sublime fiction. The first is Cornelius' explanation of the epithet, Hermes of the golden rod. Of the golden rod, Chrysohrapis, Cornelius writes, because a beating, chapismos, from him is very precious, since timely admonitions and the attention of those who listen is worth a great deal. In other words, verbal castigation is like being beaten with a golden rod. Hermes' rod, Rhabdos, returns later in the discussion, quote, with which, as Homer writes, he soothes the eyes of whomever he wishes, i.e. the eyes of the mind, and arouses those who are dreaming. for he's easily able both to encourage those who are slack and to sedate those who are excited. For the same reason people believed he sent dreams and was a prophet, turning impressions whichever way he wanted." End quote. In other words, Hermes Rods represents the power of words to magically stimulate, sedate, or generally lead listeners wherever the speaker wishes. If we permit ourselves to suspect this is slightly phallic, Cornelius will reward our audacity. Quote, "The ancients made older bearded statues of Hermes with erect genitals, but younger, smooth-cheeked statues with flaccid ones, letting it be surmised that in those of advanced age, reason is fruitful and complete, but fruitless and incomplete in immature men." In other words, mature reason is like an erect penis. Rational admonition is like a very precious beating from an erect golden penis. With this erect penis, you can guide your listeners wherever you wish. None of this adds anything to the symbolic signification of logos, I don't think, but it certainly enriches its signifiance. In other words, it doesn't change the meaning of rationality, but it makes it more meaningful, whether you find it enjoyable, amusing, or repulsive, for these are all metastases of jouissance. Now just my conclusion. I want to return to the question of the true life of interpretations. For Kristeva, as we have seen, this is a life in which each individual's rational commitments are always amenable to revision from two directions. First, by engagement with the a-signifying internal forces of imaginary and semiotic jouissance, and second, by engagement with other people, including those people's imaginary and semiotic fantasies and compulsions. That is why Kristeva insists that the interpretations must be in the plural. She believes that healthy ethics and politics require a combination of sharing, shared reason, and openness to unreasonable, unshared singularities. From this perspective, Kristeva criticizes the Stoic life as one that totalizes interpretation, thus impeding creative renewal, tolerance, and cooperation. In response, I suggested that Kristeva is partly right. Stoics do sometimes display a proclivity toward ideological rigidity, but at the same time, parts of their ideology build in precisely the sort of stimulation for creativity that Kristeva demands. For example, they aspire to alignment with God's volition, which is not even in theory knowable. Furthermore, even the partial alignment represented by virtue, which is in theory achievable, is in practice a receding goalpost. Thus it should come as no surprise that creative improvisation appears in many corners of Stoic literature, which is a vast corpus, much of which receives very little attention. I haven't mentioned Cleanthes's Hymn to Zeus, much less the astrological poetry of Aratus and Cleomedes, much less the tragedies of Seneca. I have one final suggestion to leave you with. If there's any soundness in these conjectures, might it follow that divine volition is far more essential to the Stoic life of interpretations than modern interpreters sometimes believe? Might the so-called return to religion in modern European philosophy draw inspiration from Stoic theology? Moreover, could this trend in turn generate creative new readings of Stoic philosophy? I look forward to hearing your interpretation of this and the other suggestions that I have made. Thank you.